Good morning. Welcome to the 2021 edition of ISSST. We have a treat in store for the opening conversation today. We have Cindy Cooper from the Lemelson Foundation. I'm not going to read her bio since that's already been submitted. Cindy and I sort of met by happenstance, and turns out that our worlds are working in similar spaces, and I'm really encouraged to listen to what Cindy has to report out on the Engineering for One Planet framework. This is a framework that I'm quite excited about. I had a chance to participate in its development and creation. And I think it holds quite a bit of value in terms of shifting how education and engineering, particularly innovation and invention space, is treated in the education space for training the next generation of folks. And I'm really encouraged because we start from the premise of one planet, which is a bold statement, and it is a statement that needs to be made. And I want to welcome Cindy. And this is a pre-recorded conversation from Cindy, but then we'll join for our live Q&A. So take it away.
Hey, everybody. I'm really delighted to be here. I'm Cindy Cooper. I'm a program officer for the Lemelson Foundation. I've recorded this because my hope is that if you watch the recording, I can be available to engage with you live. Like if you have questions come up while I'm presenting, that I could have the opportunity to actually answer those as we go, and you don't have to wait until the end. So hopefully this experiment will work well for everybody. It's such a delight to be here. I really want to thank the ISSST for the invitation, and Minal for having me, and all of you for participating and joining this discussion. I'm really excited to connect with you. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides so we can get started. I'll be talking about a systems change approach to integrating core environmental sustainability curricula in all engineering disciplines. And that is the work that we are doing in Engineering for One Planet. The Engineering for One Planet initiative is a fairly new initiative of the Lemelson Foundation. We have co-catalyzed it with our partner VentureWell, and really have worked with a community of hundreds of stakeholders to get it to the point that it is today. And then, we'll be working together with stakeholders to move it forward. And it won't be just our initiative, and it isn't just our initiative. We're really just providing the catalytic force and helping to convene and support the efforts of this work. So I'll tell you more about that in a second. And I'll also tell you a little bit more about the Lemelson Foundation. We're a small family foundation based in Portland, Oregon. We have 12 staff, and I'll share a little bit more in a second. But first, I really wanted to talk a little bit about systems change. What do I mean by a systems change approach? So I'm going to give us a little bit of shared grounding on that. And even before that, I would like to start with a quote. This quote is, "If you want different results, do not do the same things," by Albert Einstein. It's kind of hard to argue with that, right? Pretty simple, but profound. I would say another thing that we need to get different results is a number of different people working on different things toward a common purpose. And that's a core idea in systemic change and systems change work. When you have a complex system, you have different people who are going to take different actions. And if they're thinking about a common purpose, they have a better opportunity to get toward that common purpose than if they just work in isolation, creating change on their own. Sort of like thinking about music and harmony, where different instruments or different voices have different roles to play and different pieces that they bring. And the result is beautiful, harmonious music. So what's systems change? This is a nice breakdown of different parts of the definition. It's from Forum for the Future. And they talk about here what a system is. System is a configuration of parts connected by a web of relationships towards a purpose. It can be an ecosystem, such as a marine environment, the food system, or socially created systems such as education, which is what we're going to talk about, and health. They can be small or large. I think that point is really interesting. What's the boundary of the system? And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. And a systems approach shifts the focus from the individual parts to how the parts are organized, recognizing that interactions of the parts aren't static and constant, but dynamic and fluid. They affect each other. And then systemic change is where relationships between different aspects of the system have changed towards new outcomes and goals. And it's driven by transformational, not incremental change. So let's take an example of what I mean by the boundary. This system can be small or large, right? And that really has big implications, how you define the system. With engineering for one planet, you'll see we've kind of defined our boundary as engineering education. But let's take here a very simplistic example. If you were defining a family system, what would it be? How would you define a family system in your life? Is it yourself? Is it your nuclear family, your partner? Maybe it's your chosen family, your friends that you consider your family. Perhaps you think of it as your family of origin, the people that were around and raised you when you grew up. Perhaps you think of your extended family. Maybe that's the family system that we're talking about. You know, how far do you extend that? Like, well, what do you mean by extended family? And are you talking about just current generations or past generations? How are you defining that? And what about pets? Are pets part of your family system? Plants? Do you consider them as part of your family system? You know, we've all heard the saying, it takes a village to raise a child. So is the village the family system? Is that the boundary? So a point being that where you kind of envision, where you draw that system boundary will shape how you work, how you think about who the stakeholders are in the system and the change you're trying to reach and how you need to engage stakeholders and how you do that in concert. This is also from a related Form for the Future effort called School of System Change. They have this nice graphic, which does a really good job of providing a quick overview of kind of the how-to for practicing systems change. I think it's important to notice that everything revolves around the central purpose in the middle, very appropriately. So all of these activities and practices around the central purpose are in service of that central purpose. So you see things like engaging different perspectives, right? I'm going to talk about engaging stakeholders a lot in this conversation today. Thinking about the work that's happening concurrently, but at different levels, questioning assumptions, embracing complexity, considering different timescales, consequences over time. You know, all of these things are part of practicing systems change. And you think about them and how they serve that central purpose. So with that very, very high level grounding of systems change, I'm going to turn to talking about engineering for one planet and what it is. So the aspiration for engineering for one planet, or EOP for short, is that, you know, we have this vision. All engineers will be equipped to design, build, code, and invent with the planet in mind. This is not currently happening today, and it's a pretty ambitious aspiration. So, you know, how do we get there? Well, where are we going to draw our boundary? What system are we talking about, and what boundary within that system? So in this case, we've really focused on this transformation of engineering education. You know, so the approach that we're taking is transform engineering education so all engineers are equipped with the understanding, knowledge, and skills to ensure their work contributes to a healthy world for lifetimes to come. So the idea here is that a critical stepping stone, a critical path, critical system for getting to the ultimate goal of all engineers having this knowledge is to intervene in the education of engineers. We have to change education. To get to that end state is no small task, right? So even though we're bounding this in engineering education, that's already really huge. There are over 600,000 students enrolled in undergrad engineering programs in the US alone. So it's still really massive. It's a huge system. It's an entrenched system. Things are done certain ways and they have been for a long time, and it's hard to create change. One of the key things that we've done over the past couple of years is we've engaged with hundreds of stakeholders, because this is not something that we can do on our own. It really requires stakeholders from different parts of the system. And again, why engineering education? Well, engineers are a good starting point because they have outsized impact on everything around us, our whole built environment, the world around us. And most engineering students aren't actually learning about sustainability, environmental sustainability as part of their, core knowledge. They might be exposed to it and they're required to be exposed to it on some level, but they're not really getting a deeper understanding and learning unless they're choosing to, particularly if they specialize in environmental engineering or sustainable engineering, or they choose, to focus in on these topics as part of their engineering degree. But by and large, across engineering disciplines, mechanical, industrial, civil, it just varies how much students are getting exposed. And some of those disciplines do more of this already than others, electrical, software, etc. So, how do we think about filling this gap? What if all engineers had some fundamental knowledge in environmental sustainability? And I talked about how we're using the systems change approach, and that we've bound it in engineering education. So why are we using a systems change approach? Why does that matter? Do we really need to think about it this way? This really connected system? Well, this is a very rough representation of the engineering education system. It's very simplified. And it just shows here how many key stakeholder groups influence the engineering education system. They're interdependent. Actions in one group can affect others, even though they might not be directly in touch with each other. And it's complex. So we really need to think about, understanding the roles, motivations, the needs, the goals of these different groups, and how do we help them to see each other and connect with each other and activate changes toward common purpose. They could even be operating at odds with each other. So we have to kind of coalesce and work toward a common purpose, and we need the different groups to work together. There isn't a magical sort of like, hey, if we just influence this one group, it'll all be solved. We can just work with higher ed, and they'll do this. It doesn't matter what industry wants. Why doesn't it matter? Well, it does, right? Because higher ed can't make decisions without considering what employers are going to want when they're hiring students coming out of higher ed programs, right? So it's interdependent. Industry also needs to work closely with higher ed. They can't work independently without considering what are they going to need employees to be able to do, and so what do they need to learn in higher ed? They influence each other, et cetera, et cetera. No one group can do it alone. So how do we bring those groups together? Well, this is a slide, really to start to introduce to you a little bit about the Lemelson Foundation. So why are we working on this effort? How did we get involved in Engineering for One Planet? Where we've co-launched this with VentureWell and with input from hundreds of stakeholders, but why? So let me tell you a little bit about what we've been doing and who we are. The foundation is a family foundation in Portland, Oregon, and our mission is improving lives through invention. There's a fundamental belief about the importance of inventions to addressing the critical challenges of our time. We really want to help to create the next generation of inventors who are creating amazing solutions. And at the same time, we recognize that those inventors need to be sure that those solutions don't become the problems of tomorrow. So that's something that the foundation really values a great deal and has really worked to integrate in the things that we've supported over the years. We were started by Dolly and Jerry Lemelson. Really, Jerry was a prolific inventor. He had over 600 patents and probably was the most prolific independent inventor of the last century. The two of them believed in the power of invention to improve lives. But how do we get these inventions? Well, we need inventors. And so they set up the foundation to inspire, educate, and support the next generation of inventors. And we work to do that in the US, as well as in a couple of places outside of the US. In the US, we're particularly focused on the educational pathway, and we work in K-12 through higher ed. Outside of the US, in India and East Africa, we support the development of the pipeline of inventors, but we also do more around supporting the needs of invention-based enterprises with a focus on addressing the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And I should mention the foundation was founded just over 25 years ago, and since then has provided more than $290 million in support of the mission of improving lives through invention. I talked a little bit about the values of the foundation, and those are reflected in this notion of impact inventing. So what do we mean by that? That's a phrase that the foundation coined to reflect this idea that the kind of inventing we'd like to see and have students be learning about involves these three aspects: that inventions should have positive impact, social and or environmental impact, that they should be environmentally responsible, environmentally sustainable. So again, let's minimize the potential negative consequences, minimize environmental footprint, really be thinking about not just a solution in isolation of what does that new invention do to the world, in how it's designed and the material selection and the full life cycle, embodied energy. We want inventors to learn about that and integrate that in their thinking as they design new inventions and design business models. And then third is this piece about the invention having a path toward use through a business model. So it's not just an idea that is on the shelf, but that there is a viable path to taking that idea forward and into the world and to be commercialized. So that's impact inventing. And that shows up in our work. An example of where this has shown up is in this work that we do with a program called VentureWell. This again here is Jerry Lemelson. When he started the foundation, he also started what has now become VentureWell. It had a different name when it began, but it's this nonprofit that is still a partner grantee of ours that would foster the next generation of collegiate inventors. So since the foundation started, VentureWell, which was called something else, has been working toward that goal. And they've expanded beyond that, but that's been sort of the core of their work from when the foundation first supported it and when Jerry conceptualized it. And one of the key programs, one of the core programs that VentureWell still runs today is called the E-Team program. And this is a program to provide college and university students that have promising inventions with the opportunity to get some accelerator type training, some early stage startup support. They also get some grant support, so some funding for prototyping and starting their ventures. And VentureWell really specializes in that and really supporting these early stage businesses and inventions. And in working with students, we're always learning together. And one of the things that VentureWell integrates in its E-Team program is this idea of impact inventing. And through projects that we've supported, VentureWell and other grantees have developed tools and sort of these training tools so that the inventors that are going through their education programs are learning about inventing green, learning how to be environmentally responsible in developing their inventions, learning how to create business models that are environmentally responsible, environmentally sustainable. So that's gotten integrated into this E-Team program that VentureWell runs. And a few years ago, VentureWell surveyed E-Team participants and learned something interesting. They learned that 70% of the students in the program said that personal sustainability is of utmost importance, but a full 60% had not considered the environmental impacts of their invention, of their design, before they started to use the Inventing Green training toolkit that VentureWell offered in this startup training program. So that's a weird disconnect. First of all, these are students that are coming in with like world-changing ideas. They have these novel inventions. They are using them to solve important problems. They have all this personal commitment to sustainability, but they weren't really translating that into how they were designing their product and thinking about the business model until VentureWell talked about it in the training program in Inventing Green. So why is that? So another thing that's interesting is that a lot of these students are coming from engineering departments. The Lemelson Foundation really focuses primarily on invention of things that have physical properties that are hardware based. And that gets reflected in the E-Team program that VentureWell runs because we support that. So a lot of the new inventions coming into E-Teams are coming out of engineering programs. They're hardware-based inventions. So we started to wonder, well, what's going on? We started to think about going further upstream. Before students become inventors and they're in their engineering classes, what are they learning or what aren't they learning? So those are some of the things that have been impressed upon us, and that really reflect why we would get involved or start something like Engineering for One Planet. But I also wanted to stop and say, well, who else cares about this? Why does this matter beyond those of us who already care, right? And there are some major reasons why this matters. And one, of course, is what we all see around us every day. It's the obvious level and increasing significance of the environmental problems that we face. It's undeniable. The environmental issues are an imperative. We've got to make a difference, and we're seeing this reflected everywhere. This is a quote from the UN Secretary General talking about making nature a priority. It's everywhere, and we're hearing about it all the time. I'm sure you all agree. And furthermore, these aren't just environmental issues. It's not just nature. It's our lives, and it's a social issue. It's also a racial equity issue. In the US, there are numerous studies that have shown that people of color suffer higher health and safety burdens from pollution and climate change. And we see those burdens also being worse for people in low income areas and low income countries. Another reason why there is more attention and urgency, and others are getting more involved in supporting the need for sustainability, is because there's a business case. And this has been talked about in business for a number of years, but in the last couple of years, we're seeing a lot more commitment and serious action toward business integrating sustainability in meaningful ways. These are just a couple of examples here on this slide where we're seeing, basically all CEOs from the largest companies saying this is important to the success of their business. We're seeing this institutional investor, BlackRock, that has more than $6 trillion under management, saying this is part of our investment thesis. We're looking for sustainability and companies practicing sustainability. And every week there's news about commitments that companies are taking to net zero. So the climate change piece of this is huge. It's really becoming part of how businesses are run. It's important to business, and that does make a huge difference. It's the right thing to do, and it needs to be done. And so companies are really getting on board in big ways. And then of course we've got the young people who are growing up as climate change, climate crisis natives. They're demanding that they learn about what to do, through their education. They're demanding that employers bring sustainability into their practices. So this is something that is front and center for the younger generations, and it really is incredibly urgent. And we see that reflected, for example, in the Greta Thunberg efforts, with millions of people who are walking out and striking and asking for things to change. Specifically, that's related to climate change, but we see similar energy and passion and calls for action in all kinds of environmental issues. So there's more need and collective will than ever to address our environmental imperatives, which are also social and business imperatives. And we need the people to get there. So engineering is a powerful place to focus. We've got more than 130,000 undergrad engineering degrees awarded each year in the US alone. Think about how different the world would be if all of those engineers were graduating equipped with skills and knowledge in environmental sustainability. And those engineering graduates, they're not just working in engineering professions specifically, they go on to lead in all sectors. They are in government, business, social science, everywhere, philanthropy. So it is also thinking about creating the people who have this thinking, regardless of where they end up working. But engineering has a huge impact on our world. So how do we get there? If we're going to change engineering education, how do we get there? How do we get to the impact that will actually change education? We know that it's going to take all hands on deck, and we need new practices, new solutions. We need the people to get there. Well, this is a roadmap that is a very high level distillation of what we've been learning from talking to stakeholders over the years about what it'll take to kind of get to that next phase in this roadmap, toward the ultimate outcome here on the right hand side, that all future engineers will have these kinds of capabilities to practice environmental sustainability, and it will just be part of how engineering is done. So these three high level buckets reflect kind of steps that we're taking with this community of stakeholders. One is, okay, well, we've got to teach things differently. So we need different teaching tools. So number one is really reflecting that we need to develop and test teaching tools, get those out there. Two, we need to actually support change efforts. It's really hard to change education, as I'm sure you know. And so, that requires some concerted effort, support. It requires resources. It requires learning. Oftentimes faculty need training to learn how to teach differently. And then three, really thinking about, okay, this is a systems change effort. Let's get the actors in the system working together. That takes a concerted effort, bringing them together, getting people familiar with each other, figuring out what projects can be done together, working collaboratively. All of that, it is an area of work that requires concerted attention and effort. So how do these play out? Here's an example for the first bucket, creating teaching tools. Well, a couple of years ago, when we were talking about, gosh, there's this need, how do we achieve this aspirational goal? It became pretty clear that we needed to talk about what is it that we think engineers need to actually learn that they aren't learning. So that needs to be defined, that needs to be, identified. So that was really the first step that we took with the stakeholder community, is developing, co-creating this Engineering for One Planet framework of learning outcomes. This is really just to provide guidance about what is it that students need to be able to learn and be able to do in their engineering education that is different than what they might be getting today. What would achieve that goal of ensuring they all have a certain set of skills? What are those skills? And that wasn't something that we were just going to do and prescribe and dictate. We tapped into all kinds of experts, academics, industry, other experts, to say, okay, here's what this group thinks is most relevant. And we developed a participative process where the stakeholders actually edited a Google document together, where they could come to webinars and discuss and debate, like, what should be in here, what should those learning outcomes be. So this was a process that took several months and engaged dozens of stakeholders, and there were also conversations, and then that ended up being all kind of synthesized into this Engineering for One Planet framework that then we shared for another year, kind of in draft form, with even more stakeholders to continue to test and refine and get feedback. But even that, that doesn't mean it's done. I do think that this is a document that continues to evolve, but there was another critical step. So now we've created this tool, but it hasn't actually been used, right? So does it work? Is it right? Are the right things in here? Are things missing? Is it effective? We also know we need more teaching resources, which also need to come, but this was the first step, right? So the next step is that we, at the Lemelson Foundation, awarded 2-year pilot grants to 5 higher ed institutions: Arizona State University, Oregon State University, University of Central Florida, University of Maryland, and Villanova University, to use that framework and create curricular changes in their engineering programs and share what they're learning. So a key goal was to actually create the changes and make an impact on students right away, start to change the curricula. 2 is like, okay, test this framework. What do you think? Is this useful? Are certain things more useful? And they had freedom to decide which elements from the framework they thought were the priority and which courses they wanted to introduce those elements into. And then as they're developing teaching tools, new syllabi, pedagogy, case studies, or identifying things that are useful tools for teaching these concepts, that they would share that so that other schools could benefit from what they learn. So they got their grants just about a year ago. So for the past year, they have been already starting this work. It's a 2-year grant. So they'll keep working through spring of 2022. on these changes in their universities. And a lot has already been learned. So we're really excited to actually have things to share now at the end of the first year, and some progress points that are super exciting. So here you can see that almost 2,000 students have taken classes that have either been created or have been modified using elements from the EOP framework. And a couple dozen courses have been created or modified as a result. Lots of faculty have been exposed in these institutions to the EOP framework. Several of them, dozens of them, are using them in courses. And like I said, as the schools are developing tools and resources, those will get shared out, and hopefully can be helpful to other schools that want to do this kind of thing. So I've kind of talked about two of the buckets in the roadmap, the creating some teaching tools, and there's more to be done, testing the teaching tools, and actually investing in curricular change. We've provided some pilot grants, and we're really trying to get other funders as well to support curricular change. We in the stakeholder group, we need other funders, and we're talking to other funders who can provide support. And then the third bucket of the roadmap is this idea of bringing more stakeholders together and working together on taking actions. We have kind of operated as this hub, talking to all these different stakeholders over the years, bringing them together for certain activities like working on the framework. And now we're really turning the corner to make this a concerted effort, this EOP Action Network. So we'll be launching the EOP Action Network this year in July through a convening, and this will be a sustained approach that will support. We want to help support bringing people together so they can figure out ways to work together and create space and opportunity for people to have those conversations and provide that structure to move ideas forward. So that's kind of the next stage. I also wanted to share one of the things that we did is that in developing our EOP community of stakeholders, we developed a strategic advisory group that provides advice to the initiative that does represent stakeholders in the system. So we have professional associations, industry representatives, academic representatives in this advisory group helping to think about the strategy for EOP and the next steps. And it's been really fantastic to engage these folks. And one of the pieces of advice we got from the initial members of the advisory group is that we needed to add students to the advisory group. So we did that last year. And now we have 3 students from diverse engineering programs, from different schools and different stages in their learning, who are also providing strategic advice, because students are the customers of this effort. And it had been really hard for us to we don't have direct lines of communication with engineering students at Lemelson, and VentureWell has it for invention students, but we wanted to really think about how do we bring the student voice in more meaningfully, and having students on the advisory group as a first step that can help us start to think about, okay, what are other ways to get students engaged? So we're always listening and learning and making changes as we go. It's all still fairly new, and we're really excited for the work. So please, if you're interested in this, contact me. This is my email address, or you can also sign up for updates through the Engineering for One Planet website. It's just engineeringforoneplanet.org. You can download the framework there. It's available for free. And just let me know, if there are any questions following up, either in conversation during this meeting or just send me a note. I want to end with a quote here. Started with a quote. Let's end with a quote. "It's not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change." And I hope that we can be part of creating changes together. And I hope that Engineering for One Planet could be something that you're involved in. I would love to hear from you if it's of interest to you. And if there are things that we talked about today that would be useful to activities you're involved in, I would be happy to talk to you about those. So thank you so much. And I hope you'll take steps with us, or that this has been helpful to your work in some other way. And I look forward to your questions.
All right. Welcome, everybody. We have ample time for Q&A today, so I'll welcome Cindy again in person as opposed to the video. Well, I guess it's still a video, but at least you're responding to what I'm saying. So we are live.
I really am here.
Yeah, so we have ample time for Q&A. We have open podiums, so folks can step in and raise your hands, and we can facilitate questions. But just to start off the conversation, maybe I'll open an opener question so we can have folks queue up for regular questions. Cindy, so I've been part of this process of that stakeholder feedback and in developing this framework. One question that comes to my mind, and I know it's a tough one to start with, but oftentimes, sustainability or sustainable development, from which sustainability was shortened for materials and engineering and such, is coming up on its 35-year anniversary. And a question that always comes to my mind is, we've been talking systems for a long, long time. And one would think that we would have a pedagogical system that has created the toolkit for students and for educators. So the question is, do you think educators are ready for this change, considering that we've had 35 years ramping up to this, and we're coming up on some really intense planet-level crises, whether that's environmental, whether that's social justice things that you were talking about, or just not simple, but deeply entrenched social problems within the material system that engineers depend on. And that's sort of the substructure that's beyond education of engineering. Maybe you can reflect on that and how we address that in the framework.
Yeah, I appreciate that question. It is really challenging because it's not a simple, like I said during the systems change kind of overview, it's not just a simple matter of, okay, we're going to talk to the right person in charge and now these things will happen and everyone will have to do them. It does require a commitment. It requires resources. And in education, it's particularly difficult because the system is designed not to change. And, as much as people widely recognize the need for changes and for accelerating changes, that work is really difficult, particularly if the system has been designed to do the opposite, right? It's supposed to be something that can be replicated over time. For many, many years, that type of model served the education system well. And the idea was that, we could provide this education in similar ways. And it's not that it needed to change all the time every year. But with the world changing as quickly as it is around us, the flexibility not being built into the system is causing some problems. And the pieces that need to come together to make that happen are not only significant, but multiple, right? So you mentioned it's really hard to get people to be able to teach this. Are we prepared? Are faculty ready to do this? And I've seen in my conversations with folks very happily a lot of enthusiasm for the required changes. And there are different levels of preparation and comfort with making the changes. So some people already know how to teach this. They're gung-ho. They want to do it. They are doing it. They want to help other people do it. We see that a lot too. And then there are those who maybe want to do it but don't know how. They need more scaffolding, more support. Maybe it's training on teaching. Maybe it's actually tools. Hey, I want to create a lesson plan on a particular topic, but I've not done it before. What are some cases that I can use? What's a project that I could create? How do I actually do it? The students definitely want it and they're demanding it. And if you think of them as our customers, that is something that creates pressure and a response in the system. And yet I agree with you, it's been slow. And so we're hoping that we can all, do our part to accelerate it. So I think everyone sees the question. It's my first time in Shindig. So yeah, right. So that was a question to the participants in this eTeams program. Students who have an invention and get selected for eTeams can take this program and they'll They'll get accelerator support for starting their invention-based business. So VentureWell decided to ask them, well, what is your familiarity with these things? Like, do you care about sustainability already? Is that something that you're coming in with? Because again, these students are coming in as change makers. So they've developed some sort of invention to solve some sort of pressing problem. It could be environmental, or it could be something completely different. There are all kinds of things. It's sector agnostic. But we were curious, VentureWell was curious, are you coming in knowing about sustainability, and how is that reflected in how you think about your invention and your business? And so that 70% was one of the questions, how do you feel about sustainability at that personal level? And that is the number of students who said it was of utmost importance. So you can extrapolate that probably other students thought it was important too, but this was like the highest level of importance. And yet the other number that I shared, the 60%, that's how many had not even considered sustainability at all relative to their invention and the business that they were going to start to take that invention to market. So such a weird disconnect, and that's what got us wondering, people see this as really important. So why aren't they translating that into what they do in this pathway, this professional pathway, this invention pathway that they've chosen? And so we started to look back at okay, well, in engineering education, you might choose to study environmental engineering or sustainability, but you're not necessarily going to go very deep on those topics if you're not specifically pursuing them, right? It's not necessarily part of your experience. In fact, for most engineering students, they might get exposed to sustainability, but they're not learning very deeply about, how to take that personal value and turn it into what they do in their work.
One more question coming through.
Okay, what kind of pedagogy was used in the programs that were developed, and do you have any type of metrics to determine levels of success? Yeah, so with the pilot grants that we've funded, they're a year into a 2-year grant. And I should say that these were seed grants. So this was to help support, with a very small amount of money, the catalyzing of this effort to test the framework in action. These learning outcomes in the Engineering for One Planet framework are things about, for example, life cycle assessment, systems thinking, environmental literacy. How do those get translated into pedagogy? And that's what these pilot grantees have been working to do. They received $30,000 to use over 2 years. So it's really just paying for a little course buyout time, for some graduate research help, or for evaluation. This isn't millions of dollars to create change. It was really to test and create proofs of concept. So the pedagogy used depended on what the projects wanted to do. And we purposely didn't prescribe how they needed to create the changes, that we set high-level goals for the grants. So things like modify at least one course, develop a measurement and evaluation system so that you know what progress has been made, share what you're learning. The pedagogy that you develop for your particular project, let's share that with others so that they might benefit and learn, the syllabi, etc. The way that the projects are being evaluated then need to be customized to the specific approaches of each institution. So one institution might have started with mechanical engineering and civil engineering, but a different institution might have started with a course that was offered to all sophomores, across all different disciplines. It just depended on what they thought was the most the easiest or the most functional entry point for their institution. So it was just important for them to develop their own way of measuring the success in their contexts, while we're also tracking overall success in terms of things like how many students have been exposed, how many faculty, what's the learning that's been gained, as well as learning about how does the curricular transformation process take place, like what helps to create curricular transformation, what gets in the way, what are some ways to overcome things that get in the way, and to share those out so that others who might want to do this in their institutions have a leg up. They have some best practices and lessons learned that they can draw from. But it's just really a first step.
So we have one more question in the text, but before we go to that, maybe it'll go.
How accessible are students who give strategic advice? Are we able to contact them directly? I would suggest contacting me, and then I can make a connection. So feel free to email me, cindyc@lemelson.org, and I'm happy to help facilitate those introductions.
Oh, good. So I was going to have a follow-up question to the comment that you just finished, the last response before the email. Is that, oftentimes within institutions of education, higher education, or however it might be, there's a need for bridging. So the chemistry department is independent of the mechanical engineering department, is independent, the biology department is independent of what. And what deep sustainability asks is that we approach it as human beings. A person is connected to all sorts of things. We don't partition, we don't isolate. Can you talk a little bit about how EOP might facilitate that? I'm not asking that you have a solution, but how we might facilitate that. In my own experience, engaging as an outsider with universities, regardless of your expertise or what you're bringing to the table, the outsider tends to be left out because people in the university knows best. And I don't mean an insult here, but we're talking about significant change making that requires significant structural changes. And there's a difficult process of unlearning things within ourselves before we can accept to learn new things, and then go to the next step of building the capacity to teach others to think that way.
That's beautifully said.
Run with that thread.
I couldn't agree with you more, Minal. I think that is really essential. It's sort of the philosophical underpinning of what does it actually take to get there, and it's as much about what are we bringing in as it is what are we leaving behind. The bridging, I think, is also a really important question. So there are a couple ways I think about that. And one is certainly what you're saying. There's a personal transformation that needs to happen, or hopefully that there's already some interest and affinity for how do I think about my role in connecting with others. I think it takes an openness, and maybe that is part of what needs to be taught or unlearned if those walls exist. I think another level of it is, for example, in the Engineering for One Planet framework, the learning outcomes for students include not just LCA or systems thinking. They include things like understanding socially responsible business, understanding communications, so the importance of collaboration and communications, that those are things that are also part of what needs to be learned, because you can't do this work alone. It is as much about understanding the hard skills of an LCA calculation as it is about how to connect and communicate with those who are from a different background, a different area of work. I can give an example to illustrate how in practice we've seen really some great efforts to create those bridges in the pilot grantees. I'll give one example. We provided a tool to the pilot grantees, just a landscape analysis spreadsheet. So it's just kind of a set of sheets to capture information about what is taking place on their campus. So, what are, for example, courses that currently include sustainability? What are courses that could be good starting points for adding more sustainability? What are other faculty who might be interested? What's happening in other places around campus? A number of different things to really understand what the current state is and the leverage points are. So one of the schools, Oregon State University, took this spreadsheet, and besides just like trying to fill it out themselves, they actually turned it into a survey, and they worked with deans not only in engineering and across the different disciplines in engineering, but they reached out to deans. They had their deans reach out to other deans from other schools to share the effort and to invite their faculty and staff to fill out this survey that then populated this landscape analysis. So as just one very tactical approach, literally like putting something in front of people to consider whether they care about this topic and what their connection might be, and start to create those relationships. And I do think that fundamentally, we need to go very early. I mean, I think so at a higher level, thinking about how do we bring this kind of thinking, these mindsets, the value for working with people from different backgrounds, the empathy to kids. We need to start really young. There's no reason why kids shouldn't be learning about sustainability concepts at very young ages. It just needs to be threaded into everything that is being learned. I don't see it as necessarily being about like, okay, let's add a course on sustainability, but a way of thinking about the work that can be threaded into the sciences, the math, the language classes. It can just be part of how we think about what it means to be a person even. So there are lots of ways that we need to address it, and I certainly don't have the answers, but it's nice to see that there are some tactical things that are helping.
Well, thanks.
What do you think?
Well, we'll have our time for discussion at a different time, but this is about EOP. So we're still waiting for more questions. Please drop your, I think we have close to 40 people here, so there's got to be more questions other than me. So while we
spoke about something too, really indirectly, I'll just add like humility. The idea that if you feel like an outsider trying to come into higher ed, for example, and maybe you feel that your ideas are dismissed, I think that part of that mindset that is really important to shift is that sense of listening with a willingness to be changed. So again, that inner work, that all of us need to bring, and it's not just about what somebody else needs to do differently, but what kind of humility and openness do we have ourselves? And if we can all be a little bit more open that way and vulnerable and willing to be influenced, I think that helps with those issues of us versus them, or being an insider and outsider. We are all people, so developing those connections at a very human level.
Awesome. So that brings me directly to the next question. And of course, we didn't plan this, so
No.
I want to focus on the word "one planet." In sustainability, there's a very small group of us who actually speak in those terms of the planet as a living planet, and this is an engineering framework, and an engineering framework thinks of the planet as an engineered system, which it is not. It's a living system, just like your body and my body. So, and we're talking about connections here. So we're talking about shifting connections in terms of how we approach teaching, how we approach sustainability as a whole, as a framework rather than as a specific attribute. Can you talk about in the development process how you all, because I know initially it wasn't called Engineering for One Planet, how the mindset in the stakeholder engagement and discussions shifted from the basics of engineering towards this notion of well-being and this larger concept of one planet.
Yeah, it's challenging because on the one hand, I agree that the idea of one planet, the connectedness, really speaks to that whole system approach, the living system. And on the other hand, I talked about boundaries in the presentation. It's like, where do you begin? It's really hard to tackle one planet. So I think of it as more like inspirationally oriented, that we need to think that way. It's one planet, it's connected, it's interdependent. Nature, life, these things aren't separate notions. These are all parts of what makes things vibrant together. So the way that this evolved, originally when we were asking ourselves these questions, it was about our core mission, improving lives through invention. We then started to look at inventing green and this idea that, okay, well, the inventors are creating solutions for all kinds of different problems. How do we ensure that those solutions are environmentally responsible? Ensuring that the solutions of today don't become the environmental problems of tomorrow. And we talked about it in that way. So that was sort of the core, was where things germinated for the Lemelson Foundation, was this idea of environmental responsibility. And then as we started to see that there was a need for more systemic shifts, or, to really think about like, okay, so we're just touching the inventors that we get to, right? There's like some small microcosm of folks that we're connecting with through our programs directly. Gosh, maybe as we talk to people, there's a need to do more in the system and to think about changing education. And because of our connection to invention and the engineering links that I talked about, we started with engineering because engineering has such a huge impact on all of those living systems. We thought this is a really powerful place to start. But honestly, everything in the framework could be applicable in any science and in really kind of any context. They're really generalizable themes, and maybe how they're interpreted or specifically taught in different disciplines might change. Your question is a really provocative one. So then how does it get to engineering for one planet? And it was through that stakeholder engagement, kind of going from this focus on environmental responsibility, which really turned a lot of people off. It felt loaded, like, so are we, not responsible if we're not doing, does this imply something about other engineers or other people? There's a judgment associated with that terminology, and it felt too narrow to people. And it was, something that we brought up time and time again in our stakeholder engagement. And the way that it shifted was through a conversation with a small group of stakeholders that we held a couple of years ago to talk about how do we create the roadmap. This is before the framework was developed. It was before we had really a strategic plan for taking things forward. And the idea for Engineering for One Planet came out kind of organically from a discussion and brainstorm about terminology and, how to reflect really what is needed here. And, that's where it originated from. It's exactly like you were saying, that these are interconnected systems. And a lot of times we think about us as being maybe the primary beneficiary or the most important part of a system, and yet we're all interdependent, and things that we're doing that negatively affect nature, that's not outside of us. We are nature too. So we really liked that idea of something that was more encompassing of those interconnections.
Excellent. We have 2 more questions from the audience. So here's first one.
Okay. How can the systems perspective and stakeholder engagement be integrated into the implementation of the EOP framework in higher education? Yeah, I'm not sure if you mean at an institutional level or kind of what we're doing with the implementation of EOP, and the thinking being that we need to have the stakeholders continue to be representative of different parts of the system talking to each other. And in this next stage of work, as we launch this Engineering for One Planet Action Network, that's what we'll do. We are supporting, it takes effort, it takes money, it takes time to create events like this one, to bring people together and have these conversations, and to have them more than once, and to actually not just have a conversation with somebody one time and hope that something comes out of it, but to have follow-on conversations and to talk to people in between official meetings. So those are approaches that we're taking to this network that we're building for EOP. So for example, we will meet in July and launch the network. The people at that meeting are going to get to know each other. They're maybe even going to start to identify ways that they might collaborate. We will help to facilitate those conversations during the event and after. So we're going to literally follow up with everybody who attends that meeting individually to find out, what they're thinking, how we can support them. Are there people that they wanted to connect with? And then we'll have another meeting in a few months where the participants will be welcomed to come back, and we'll continue to bring those threads and conversations together. So having the continuity, it doesn't end at the end of that meeting. So how you approach that work, thinking of it as a long-term investment, thinking of it as a series of connections and building relationships and partnerships, not just having events over time that dump information, because a network approach is a little bit different than that. It is about how do you facilitate the partnerships, the relationships, and the work. So that's how we're thinking about it there. At an institutional level, things like connecting with other stakeholders to do a landscape, like I talked about earlier, that can be a way of bringing people together, of finding out who your other champions are on a campus. because that's another sort of system within which work needs to be done together. Things like bringing outsiders, bringing in industry, bringing in the regulatory professionals, bringing in government to have conversations within the institution. All of that needs to be part of developing that stakeholder engagement for systems change. Okay, great. I see another question. Greatly enjoyed your perspective EOP engineering storytelling. We gave a talk on the subject at the 2016 event, Nelson Literacy and Leadership Management Skills of Sustainable Product Designers. Oh, great. Well, I maybe I can watch that. Is that something that is available on the site? We don't know. Yeah, so maybe send me a link. Yeah. Changes and opportunities for sustainability education in a post-pandemic world. Many of us have been teaching online for more than a year. Yeah, that was actually, I don't know that I think from what I hear talking to faculty, I haven't been in the classroom for a few years now, but in my conversations with our grantees for the pilots and others that I interact with regularly, there's just a lot of optimism for being back together in person. It's been so hard. And at the same time, I think important lessons have been derived. So, I think my comment would be that we can very quickly adapt, that we can think about how we do things in ways that are radically different than what we assumed was possible, and that those are important lessons that transfer into sustainability education. All of these things that people didn't think we could do, we're doing. We're having all conferences online. We are teaching online. We are having meetings online. We're working, from remote locations. And 18 months ago, I think most of us would have, if we'd been asked, can you operate 100% without meeting other people and get important things done and develop relationships and make meaningful progress? A lot of us maybe would have been skeptical that can be done without face-to-face interactions. And while there are certainly obvious advantages of being together in time and space, I think we found out that we're capable of a lot more through creative means and through change when we absolutely have to. And I think that we need to be thinking about the environment and the climate in the same way. We don't have the luxury of the best conditions. We have to act and accelerate change in the face of the challenges, and that it isn't just it's too hard or it's not possible, but how might it be possible? We need to ask ourselves different questions. How might I do more?
Excellent. Thanks for ending with how might we ask different questions. That's a question or a mindset that's really close to me, and I'm sure with ISST as well. I want to ask one last question before we bring up we skipped the introduction for the day and jumped right into your presentation, so we want to do a reverse order. But my closing or your closing, your quote was Darwin's quote. And in that quote, it's the adaptation to change. Much of the adaptation that he's talking about is minute scale that isn't visible. Genetic changes, adaptation to some environmental stress and things like that. And it's the kind of change that we are in. A lot of times these changes in engineering are sort of choices, whereas again, going back to the one planet in the larger philosophical sense, is that choices are not necessarily our own. They are subjected, or we encounter them oftentimes. And in the engineering space, that's really the place. We're sort of imagining a problem, perhaps, approaching it through a solution creation, or that there is really a problem and then we're trying to address that problem. In that, Yeah, and I think that there's a. Can you just speak to what are the aspirations of this action network? Where do we see ourselves going as a group of people, and how do we keep it connected? Is Lemelson going to continue to play a role, or should we be looking for pods that we're creating along the way?
Yeah, I think both. I think that part of what you're, again, so poignantly speaking about is like the responsibility for choice, and that we need to be better equipped, or just more aware of our own role in developing those choices. And like you said, sometimes it is about something that's happening to you, but we can also let that stop us from understanding our full power. So even at the micro level of our own interactions with each other, just having a greater awareness for how much that we can really do to speak out, or to make different choices, or to ask others to make different choices, and not to take things for granted as having already been decided and done. We really do need to stand up and make those decisions. And the Lemelson Foundation's role, that question about what happens next, we are really committed to this effort, and hopefully it's useful to other efforts as well. And we also recognize we are one funder, a modest-sized foundation. We can do part of this, and part of what we can do is look for other partners, other funders, other resource providers, industry, to amplify the work. So we really see our role as being a catalytic role. That's where we've been able to help as a convener, as a group that can talk about these topics and then continue to bring others in. And it's something that we're very committed to and passionate about. And it also means that I hope that we can role model the importance of stepping into the uncertainty. There's really no playbook here. We're doing our best to learn and see what others have done in similar domains or in similar efforts, to learn from the wisdom of others and to take this forward. And others, you mentioned, are others going to take this work on? Will there be other pods of things? I hope so, absolutely. How can we continue to work in parallel, but also integrate and overlap when possible, and step into what is it that I could do? How can I have more of an impact? How can I raise more questions? How can I work within the uncertainty? How can I elevate my voice to accelerate the work and to create really choiceful changes?
Well, that's a good way to end, I think. Cindy, I want to thank you again for joining us. I think this is, there's a lot of potential, and I'm going to be involved in the Action Network, and I hope that'll lead us to new frontiers, and we'll certainly try to push the edges as far as we can.
Excellent.
Thanks again for being here. I'm going to hand it off to Juan Yao to do sort of the introduction for the day. So
thank you.
Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you, Mina and Cindy, for the wonderful talk. I think this is a great time to discuss about changes and adaptation, since you will all have made a lot of changes in pandemic, like we ISST will host virtually twice. And this is the first time we use the Shindig interactive platform. And by the way, I'm Yuan Yao. I'm a faculty from Yale University. I'm one of the program chairs with another two chairs, Kiara Winas from Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, and also Jason Quinn from Colorado State University. So if this is your first time to attend ISST conference, I really encourage you to take full advantage of our Shindig platform to network with others. They have a lot of fancy functions. And if you are an old friend of ISST conference, I'm really happy to see you here again. And I hope this time you will have a different while inspiring experience. Enjoy the conference.